the empire that ruled the world. For centuries, one empire stood above all others. Its ships dominated the oceans, its soldiers marched across continents, and its flag was planted in lands thousands of miles from its shores. At its height, the British Empire controlled more territory than any empire in recorded history. Nearly a quarter of the world's land and hundreds of millions of people were under its rule. From Africa to Asia, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, the influence of Britain stretched across the globe. So vast was its power that people often said, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." But what did that really mean? It meant that somewhere on the planet, at every moment of the day, British authority was being enforced. In one part of the world, a colonial governor was collecting taxes. In another, British soldiers were putting down rebellion. And in another, ships filled with goods. And sometimes, human beings were crossing the oceans under the British flag. To many in Britain, the empire represented greatness, power, civilization. They believed they were bringing law, order, and progress to distant lands. But for millions of people living under imperial rule, the reality looked very different. Because behind the stories of exploration and trade, behind the grand maps colored red to show British territory, there existed another story, a darker story. One of exploitation, of resources taken without consent, of cultures disrupted, of lives changed forever by forces far beyond their control. This is the story that many classrooms rarely explore. The story of how an island nation in Europe rose to dominate vast regions of the world, and the human cost of that domination. To understand how it all began, we must travel back several centuries, to a time when Britain was not yet an empire, when it was simply a kingdom looking outward toward the seas, a kingdom about to begin a journey that would change the course of global history. How Britain began building its empire. Long before Britain ruled vast territories across the globe, it was a relatively small kingdom on the edge of Europe. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, powerful nations such as Spain and Portugal were already exploring distant lands and establishing colonies. Ships from these nations crossed dangerous oceans in search of new trade routes, gold, spices, and land. Britain watched closely, and soon it wanted a share of that power. English merchants, sailors, and explorers began organizing long voyages across the Atlantic and beyond. These journeys were risky. Storms destroyed ships. Disease spread quickly in cramped vessels, and many sailors never returned home. But the rewards could be enormous. New lands meant new resources, and new resources meant wealth. One of the most important institutions that helped Britain expand was the East India Company. This company was created by merchants who wanted to trade with Asia. At first, the company focused mainly on commerce. They traded spices, silk, tea, and other valuable goods. But something unusual happened. Over time, this trading company began gaining military power. It built private armies, it controlled territories, and eventually it began governing millions of people. In many places, the British Empire did not begin with soldiers. It began with merchants. Trading posts were established along distant coasts. Ports were built. Local leaders were approached with trade agreements. But as British influence grew, these agreements often turned into control. Gradually, small trading settlements transformed into colonies. British governors were appointed. British laws were introduced. And British economic interests began shaping entire regions. Across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, Britain expanded its reach. By the 1700s, the foundations of a global empire were already forming. Ships carrying goods, soldiers, and settlers traveled constantly between continents. But one system, in particular, would play a massive role in expanding Britain's wealth and influence. A system that would leave a deep scar on human history. The transatlantic slave trade. It was a brutal system of human exploitation that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And Britain would become one of its most powerful participants. As the British Empire expanded across the oceans, its demand for labor grew rapidly. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas needed workers to grow valuable crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These crops were extremely profitable in European markets. But they required intense and exhausting labor. Instead of relying on local populations or paid workers, colonial powers turned to a system that would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. A vast land with ancient civilizations, rich cultures, and enormous economic potential. That land was India. For centuries, India had been home to powerful kingdoms, thriving trade networks, and some of the world's most valuable goods. Spices, textiles, and precious materials from India were highly sought after across Europe. At first, Britain arrived only as traders. The East India Company established trading posts along India's coastline during the early 1700s. These posts allowed British merchants to buy and export Indian goods. But over time, trade slowly turned into control. The East India Company began building private armies made up of both British officers and local soldiers. These forces were used to protect company interests, but they were also used to defeat rival European traders and challenge local rulers. As conflicts between Indian kingdoms increased, the company often took advantage of political divisions. Some local leaders formed alliances with the British. Others resisted and fought against them. Through wars, treaties, and strategic alliances, the East India Company expanded its influence across large parts of the Indian subcontinent. By the late 1700s, the company had become far more than a trading organization. It had effectively become a government. Millions of people now lived under the authority of a private company based thousands of miles away in Britain. Taxes were collected, laws were enforced, and local economies were increasingly shaped by British economic interests. Many historians describe India as the crown jewel of the British Empire. The colony generated enormous wealth for Britain through trade, agriculture, and taxation. But British rule also brought growing tensions. Many Indians began to feel that their land and resources were being controlled by a foreign power. Economic policies often favored British industries rather than local producers. And political authority remained firmly in the hands of colonial administrators. By the middle of the 1800s, frustration and resentment had grown across many parts of India. Then, in the year 1857, a massive uprising erupted. It would become one of the most dramatic challenges to British rule in the region. An event remembered today as the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The rebellion shook the foundations of British authority in India, and its consequences would reshape the future of the empire. By the middle of the 1800s, British power in India had grown enormously. But beneath the surface, tensions were rising. Many Indian soldiers serving in the armies of the East India Company had begun to feel deep resentment. These soldiers, known as sepoys, were part of the very force that had helped Britain expand its authority across the region. Yet many of them believed their traditions, religions, and rights were increasingly being disrespected. In the year 1857, anger finally erupted. The spark that ignited the uprising began within the ranks of Indian soldiers stationed in northern India. Rumors spread that new rifle cartridges issued by British officers were greased with substances offensive to both Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs. To use the cartridges, soldiers had to bite them open. For many, this was seen as a serious violation of their faith. But the cartridge controversy was only the final trigger. Years of political control, economic pressure, and cultural interference had already created deep dissatisfaction among soldiers and civilians alike. Soon, the unrest spread. Soldiers mutinied against British officers. Cities and towns joined the uprising. Local leaders, former rulers, and ordinary citizens took part in what became one of the largest rebellions against British authority. This event is remembered as the Indian Rebellion of 1857. For a time, British control in several regions collapsed. Rebel forces seized cities, British officials fled, and the empire faced one of its greatest crises. But the British government responded with overwhelming force. Reinforcements were sent from across the empire. Battles were fought across northern India as British troops moved to reclaim lost territory. When the rebellion was finally suppressed, the consequences were severe. Many rebels were punished harshly. Entire communities suspected of supporting the uprising faced retaliation. The rebellion had shaken the empire, but it also led to a major change in how Britain governed India. The East India Company, which had ruled much of the India for decades, was stripped of its power. Instead, the British government took direct control. India would now be governed in the name of the British Crown. And from that moment forward, Britain tightened its grip over what had become its most valuable colony. But India was only one part of a much larger imperial system. During the late 1800s, the empire expanded rapidly across another vast continent, Africa. And the struggle for control of that continent would become one of the most dramatic chapters in the story of imperial expansion. By the late 1800s, European nations had turned their attention toward a vast and resource-rich continent, Africa. For centuries, European traders had maintained coastal trading posts along parts of the continent. But most of Africa remained under the control of powerful kingdoms, local rulers, and diverse communities. That situation began to change rapidly. European powers started competing fiercely for territory, resources, and influence across the continent. Historians later called this intense competition the scramble for Africa. Britain was one of the major participants. Driven by economic interests and strategic ambitions, British leaders sought control of key regions across Africa. Gold, diamonds, agricultural land, and trade routes all became important motivations for expansion. At the same time, European leaders feared that rival nations might gain an advantage if they did not claim territories quickly. To avoid conflicts among themselves, European powers gathered in Berlin Conference during the mid-1800s. Representatives from several European nations met to establish rules for claiming African lands. But there was one critical detail. No African leaders were invited to participate in the discussions. During the conference, maps of Africa were spread across tables. Borders were drawn. Territories were assigned, and entire regions were divided among European empires. Britain gained control over several major territories across the continent. These included regions that would later become modern nations such as Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa. For Britain, These territories represented valuable sources of resources and strategic military positions. Railways were built, colonial administrations were established, and local economies were reorganized to serve imperial interests. But the process of establishing colonial rule was rarely peaceful. In many regions, African communities resisted foreign control. Wars were fought. Local leaders attempted to defend their territories, and resistance movements emerged across the continent. In several cases, British forces used superior weapons and organized military campaigns to defeat local resistance. By the early 1900s, much of Africa had been brought under European colonial control. For Britain, the empire had now stretched across multiple continents. But beneath the surface of imperial power, tensions were slowly growing. Across Africa, Asia, and other colonies, people began questioning foreign rule. And in the decades ahead, those questions would grow into powerful movements for independence. Movements that would eventually challenge the very existence of the British Empire itself. By the early 1900s, the British Empire had reached the height of its power. British territories stretched across continents. Its navy controlled important sea routes, and its influence shaped global trade and politics. But across the empire, a new idea was beginning to grow. The idea that people should govern themselves. In many colonies, educated leaders, workers, farmers, and intellectuals began questioning foreign rule. They asked a simple but powerful question. Why should decisions about their lands be made thousands of miles away in Britain? In India, a growing independence movement began challenging British authority. Political organizations formed, protests were organized, and leaders started demanding greater rights and self-government. One of the most influential figures in this movement was Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi encouraged resistance through peaceful protest and civil disobedience. Instead of fighting with weapons, he urged people to challenge colonial authority through non-violent action. Across India, millions joined demonstrations, boycotts, and marches demanding independence. At the same time, similar movements were emerging in other parts of the empire. In Africa, political groups began organizing to demand freedom and equal rights. Local leaders spoke out against colonial rule. Workers protested economic policies that favored European interests over local communities. Even within Britain itself, some politicians and citizens began questioning whether the empire could last forever. Then, global events accelerated the pressure on the imperial system. The outbreak of the First World War changed the world dramatically. Soldiers from across the empire fought alongside British forces. Millions of people from colonies contributed labor, resources, and manpower to the war effort. But when the war ended, many began asking why they were expected to fight for freedom abroad while living under colonial rule at home. The war had weakened many European empires, and it had strengthened the desire for independence across the colonies. The foundations of the British Empire were beginning to crack. But the most dramatic changes were still ahead, because in the years to come, the empire would face even greater challenges. Global conflict, economic strain, and a rising wave of independence movements that would reshape the political map of the world. World wars and the collapse of the empire. By the early 1900s, the British Empire stood as the largest empire the world had ever seen. But powerful forces were beginning to reshape global politics, and two devastating global conflicts would accelerate the decline of imperial power. The first major turning point came with the outbreak of the First World War. This conflict drew soldiers and resources from every corner of the empire. Men from India, Nigeria, Kenya, and many other colonies were recruited to fight alongside British troops. Millions served in battlefields far from their homes. Others worked in factories, farms, and supply chains supporting the war effort. The war demanded enormous sacrifices. But when it ended, many people in the colonies expected political change. They believed their contributions to the war had earned them greater rights and self-government. Yet, in many places, colonial rule remained largely unchanged. This created growing frustration. Across the empire, movements for independence began gaining strength. Then, only a few decades later, another even more destructive conflict erupted. The Second World War. Once again, Britain relied heavily on the resources and manpower of its colonies. But the war left Britain economically exhausted. Cities had been bombed, industries were strained, and maintaining a vast global empire had become increasingly difficult. At the same time, independence movements across the colonies had grown stronger and more organized. In India, mass protests and political pressure eventually forced Britain to grant independence in the late 1940s. This moment became one of the most significant turning points in the history of the empire. Soon afterward, other colonies followed similar paths. Across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, new nations began emerging. Countries that had once been ruled by Britain were now establishing their own governments. By the middle of the 1900s, the empire that had once covered nearly a quarter of the world was rapidly dissolving. The age of colonial empires was coming to an end. But the legacy of that empire did not disappear overnight. The borders drawn during colonial rule remained. Economic systems shaped by imperial policies continued to influence societies, and debates about the impact of empire still continue today. The lasting legacy of the British Empire. Although the British Empire eventually faded, its influence did not disappear. The empire had reshaped large parts of the world, and many of the political, economic, and cultural systems created during that period still affect societies today. When Britain ruled distant territories, it often drew borders that did not always reflect the realities of local communities. In several regions, these boundaries grouped together different ethnic groups, languages, and traditions under single administrations. After independence, many newly formed nations inherited these same borders. This sometimes created political challenges that continued long after colonial rule ended. The empire also left behind institutions that shaped modern governance. Legal systems, railways, administrative structures, and educational institutions introduced during colonial rule became part of the foundation for many countries. In some places, these systems helped support the development of modern states. In others, they remained closely tied to the economic priorities of the colonial era. The English language itself became one of the most visible legacies of the empire. Today, English is spoken across large parts of the world, from Africa to Asia and the Caribbean. In many former colonies, it remains an official language used in government, education, and international communication. But alongside these influences, the history of empire also left difficult memories. Communities remember the struggles for independence. They remember the conflicts, economic hardships, and social changes that came with colonial rule. And historians continue debating how the empire should be understood today. Some emphasize the global connections and institutions created during that era. Others focus on the exploitation and inequalities that developed under colonial systems. Understanding this history requires looking at both the power of the empire and the experiences of those who lived under its rule, because the story of the British Empire is not just about maps and territories, it is also about people. Millions of lives shaped by decisions made across oceans. Millions of voices, cultures, and communities affected by a global system of power. And even though the empire itself no longer exists, its story remains deeply connected to the modern world. The nations that once formed part of that empire have taken their own paths. But the echoes of that history can still be seen in politics, culture, language, and global relationships today. That is the dark truth many history lessons only briefly touch upon. The British Empire helped shape the modern world, but its legacy is complex, and its history continues to be examined and debated even now. The British Empire once ruled vast parts of the world, shaping nations, borders, and global history. But behind its power were stories that many classrooms rarely explore. Stories of conquest, resistance, and the lasting impact of empire. Understanding this history helps us better understand the world we live in today. If you found this documentary insightful, subscribe to Untold Reality Daily for more untold stories from history. And remember, sometimes the past holds truths the world is only beginning to confront. Thank you.